We're not just talking about knowledge about these stats that there's all these jobs out there. We're talking about stuff like a tradesperson who's an electrician or a construction worker. They're already a clean energy worker, but they may not realize it, and they may not realize how to pivot into the clean energy opportunities that would increase their own economic growth.
Welcome to Building Well, Sustainable Homes, Equitable Communities, your new podcast from New Ecology. Join us as we explore real-life stories from key players in green building and community development. We'll examine exciting new innovations, highlighting practical solutions for creating more affordable, healthier, more resilient, equitable communities. We're building well together.
This episode was made possible by the Hsieh Community Education Grant.
Hello and welcome to the Building Well podcast from New Ecology. I'm Michelle Moran, and I'm here today with my co-host, Alina Michaelevich.
Hello.
As well as a very special guest, Edward Hsieh from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We're going to talk about the workforce and training needs in Massachusetts and how they fit into the larger climate goals here.
Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited. Could you please introduce yourself and Mass CEC and your work in workforce development?
Sure. So, hi, I'm Edward Hsieh. I'm the Program Director for Adult Training and Minority and Women Business Enterprise Support out of the workforce team at Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Mass CEC is a quasi-governmental agency dedicated to increasing the economic impact of the clean energy sector on Massachusetts and making sure that all individuals in Massachusetts are able to benefit from the growth of the clean energy sector.
That's great. How did you get into this work?
So my path has been kind of long. I was in sustainability to start in nonprofits. And then I went through personally some rough times. And then due to those rough times, I actually pivoted into workforce development because I understood that people needed help to be able to get to where they needed to in terms of both work and just their own personal well-being and wealth growth. So then for a while, I was actually a COO of a nonprofit running actual job training programs, designing job training programs. And through that organization, I actually pivoted into clean energy job training programs where I helped with the design of the Hsieh Clean Energy Pathways internship program. I ran and designed a hybrid electric and diesel medium heavy duty fleet vehicle mechanic program, and then also a hoisting engineering operators program and a building automation systems tech training program. So several different clean energy focused training programs.
That's great. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. This has come up a lot, the transition to the clean energy economy and the need for jobs and workforce development to get there. It's come up like several of our episodes, so we're really excited to be able to dive into it with you. What does Mass Clean Energy Center do to address workforce needs, and how does this lead to a stronger clean energy economy in Massachusetts?
Sure. The workforce efforts in the state, by and large, are actually administered by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. Granted, there are some initiatives that are handled, here and there by other government agencies, like EOWLD just announced a new revision on the Mass Talent Initiative, which is a website to match job seekers with employers, so both employers and job seekers can jump off that site and get matched. But in terms of what we do at Mass CEC, we have the bulk of the state level funding for clean energy workforce development. We can talk at length about the Equity Workforce Fund, which is driven by legislative dollars, and that supports direct career pathway training for individuals, but also supports MWBE growth. Beyond the state level funds, which, we have the Equity Workforce Fund, we have state budget dedicated funds. There are also special line items that are coming to bear around like heat pump training and HVAC training. There are also federal funds that Mass CEC administers that they, once they get awarded to the state turns around and asks Mass CEC to pick them up and support them. So for example, we will be launching the EPA Solar for All workforce development initiatives through Mass CEC. We also have DOE, what we call TREC. It's training for residential energy contractors.
Okay.
There's one that doesn't have an official name from DOE, Career and Technical Education Teacher and Externship Program, which is essentially training the trainer to be able to teach other folks about heat pumps and HVAC. So those are the main funding opportunities that we're administering. Within those, we have a lot of sub grants and opportunities for various stakeholders. We also build direct convening and support out of those funding opportunities. So we run monthly COPs, communities of practice, to help share best practices, talk about barriers, problems. We have 2 annual in-person convenings. Usually at one of those convenings, we also tie in an employer summit to let the employers match directly with our training programs and our support programs. So we have those, direct service to our grantees, but we also have other initiatives that have been long running. For example, we have several awareness and exploration initiatives like the internship program, which has been running, I think, 11 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, so that program has matched over 6,000 interested young adults with potential employers to do an internship to see if they're interested in clean energy as a potential career path. And then more recently, through a governor's mandate, we've set up an innovation pathway. And that's in conjunction with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE. So DESE runs several innovation pathways in the schools, K through 12, where they give students a quick glance at potential pathways. Like in the past, they've been geared towards IT, biomed, the typical high priority occupations in Massachusetts. But lately, they just turned over into clean energy, and we're working on the curriculum with DESE to roll out in this year and next year. So that's coming down the line because obviously you can train adults, you can train young adults, but to get people interested, you have to start early, right? So
yeah, that's a lot of touch points. The employers, you're in a lot of areas. That's awesome.
We're definitely in a lot of areas. One area I don't want to leave off is research because Mass CEC is big on data. I mean, we're known as a quasi to do data-driven efforts. So in the workforce team, we actually have a third branch that does research. And so we've put out a workforce needs assessment, which I'll talk about a lot today, as well as they're regularly involved in an industry report that comes out every year that talks about the status of the workforce of the clean energy industry. So, employers and interested participants can know where they can integrate and what the opportunities are.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you'll get a little bit into that report you just mentioned when I asked this question. What is needed in Massachusetts clean energy workforce to reach the climate goals?
Sure. So I think the first thing we have to talk about is the sort of opportunity that's created. So the workforce needs assessment as well as the industry report show that there's huge opportunity created by the 2030 and the 2050 goals for decarbonization. There's one quote that came out in the report that I picked up on that's pretty telling. So we're known, in Massachusetts as a college state, right? That's a big industry. The report points out that colleges and universities, as well as the restaurant industry, in terms of the level of opportunity and direct jobs, clean energy is right up there with them. But then even beyond that, clean energy sector offers indirect and induced jobs beyond both of those sectors, as well as a bigger impact on the state GSP, gross state product. So in terms of overall look, we're looking at 33 billion in terms of opportunity out there. And that's at the current status. There's over 200,000 jobs in the clean energy sector right now. So it's already a big industry. And so the growth is just going to make that, balloon even more. For individuals, obviously, the opportunity is wealth growth. The average median job right now in the clean energy sector is about $36 an hour starting wage. So if you get into the clean energy sector, it's not just, a low tier job, even though most of these are trades jobs, right? So then most people think trades jobs, there's been this long running education kind of push of college and desk jobs are the main way, but there are trades jobs that pay as well as, if not better than those jobs that go that other route. So that opportunity is there. The hard part, though, is the fact that there is a shortage in the labor that's needed to reach the 2030, 2050 goals. The needs assessment basically sets forth that 38,000 jobs will need to be filled to reach the 2030 goals alone. And at the same time, we know we're in a tight labor market. So I think DOL just reported in October that the unemployment rate is at 4%. So it's not the historic low, but it's very close to the historic low. And at the same time, the employers in the clean energy sector, when we surveyed them for the needs assessment, almost 90% of them said that they're having a ton of trouble finding employees for their companies. So you have those three factors. There's a huge need for new labor. There's a tight labor market. And then there's a mismatch between who's out there and who's trying to hire. So we need to address the barriers that are causing that kind of mismatch. Some of the barriers that we've seen so far, there's a lack of awareness about the opportunities. And we're not just talking about knowledge about these stats that there's all these jobs out there. We're talking about stuff like a tradesperson who's an electrician or a construction worker. They're already a clean energy worker, but they may not realize it. And they may not realize how to pivot into the clean energy opportunities that would increase their own economic growth, right? So that's a little bit of the raising the awareness that we already talked a little bit about, the student young adults, to get them understanding that, yes, there are college pathways into clean energy like engineering, architectural work, but at the same time, there's a lot of trade jobs which actually dominate the need. And those trade jobs can provide, a ton of salary. A good example that I know personally, because I was running a program in it, is if you come out and work on fleets in the transportation sector, in many cases, especially if it's a union position, you're coming out at 60 to 80K starting wage. So if you think about that, that's a pretty good starting wage. And then most of those career pathways have a very clear step up to the next stage where within a year or two, you could be earning six figures. So it's not a career to scoff at, right? It's a great wealth growth opportunity for individuals. So there's that awareness of understanding that opportunity. And in addition to that, the needs assessment points out that we're fortunate in Massachusetts to have a very robust workforce and training infrastructure. There is a gap in terms of clean energy training. So we have to address those lack of training opportunities. And there's many variations and flavors of those gaps. I mean, in some cases, it's lack of curriculum. In some cases, there's training deserts. Like certain parts of Massachusetts, it's very difficult for someone to get to a training site that's close to them. And when we're talking about populations that are underserved, that distance could be a huge barrier. Regional considerations also are a big challenge. So again, obviously in Greater Boston, you have certain needs. You have certain populations. Public transportation is easier. In Western Mass, where we think in the Eastern Mass area that driving 30 minutes is a reasonable distance, 30 minutes out west might be a much larger distance, right? And then when you build in seasonality of some of the occupations, that becomes an even bigger obstacle. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the jobs are focused in several sectors that have higher needs. So while there's 140 occupations projected to grow, about 65% of the growth is going to be focused in on 20 occupations, of which many of them have known, retention issues. They have known barriers to entry, known like technical training gaps. So filling those gaps and being focused on those barriers would be a key thing for any group trying to get into the clean energy sector and grow their business. And of course, the inclusivity. So we talked a little bit about the unemployment near record rate. So what that really should highlight to someone who's in the workforce world, and then to those who aren't in the workforce world, what it should tell them is that most of the highly employable individuals who've been educated are in the sector. So you're dealing with populations that have challenges and barriers. At the same time, those populations have been most negatively impacted by climate change in most cases. I mean, there's mappings of how the air pollutants folks along certain highways, which also map over to the low-income neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods. So it's both an opportunity to help those populations grow their wealth, and also highlights that there's going to be other challenges that have to be addressed, like socioeconomic barriers. There's going to be language barriers in some cases, and so those are things that are going to have to be accounted for when you're designing the training system and the workforce build out.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually. So those 38,000 new jobs that are required, is that by 2030 or 2050 or just all in all?
I believe the stat is 2030.
Wow.
So that's to meet the 2030 goal. And to be clear, too, that 38,000 is a full-time equivalent. So in the trades, obviously, there's many positions that won't be working, full-time on the clean energy aspect. So you might have a licensed electrician who is hypothetically working a quarter of the time on a clean energy job. But the way the needs assessment calculator, and I'm not a data expert, so I'm riffing here a little bit, but, but basically the gist is that there's going to be enough work for 38,000 full-time equivalent individuals, which may mean there's a lot more people than that 38,000.
Wow.
That's really a lot in 5 years, six years. That's amazing. What type of occupations are expected to have the highest growth?
Right now, I don't have the full list of 20 in front of me, but I can tell you the top 10.
Yeah.
So the top two, where a lot of the growth is going to be seen, is electricians and construction. And that kind of tracks because if you think about it, we're talking the biggest sectors with needs are building and electrification. And anything around buildings would require construction labor. Obviously, solar is going to see big growth. Offshore wind is going to see big growth. So if you track it over to the projects that are coming down the line in terms of big investment, they're all related to those two major occupations. Beyond that, the ones that are a little bit more surprising might be, like office supervisors or line managers, the folks that kind of are the middle tier and making sure that the labor is, going in the right direction. Because a lot of time, obviously, you talk about the trades, you're talking about entry level, and people aren't thinking, well, there's a clear career trajectory where people have opportunities to move up the line and continue their wealth growth. So it's important to emphasize that. Beyond the top 10, though, there's also sort of the customer service sales. There are many opportunities to get into the sector beyond the trades and, the management side of it.
Yeah. Wow. So there's a lot of opportunity for professional growth and also wealth growth, like you mentioned. Why is ensuring that the transition to a green economy is equitable so important, and how is MACC working towards that equitable outcome?
Sure. In terms of the need, in many sectors, it's talked about as something important from an ethical, moral standpoint, right? But even beyond that, from MASS-CEC standpoint, looking at the unemployment rate, there's no way to meet the need without working to bring those populations into the labor force.
Yeah.
Because there's also that flip side again that I mentioned earlier, that for a long time the youth have been told the only route is the college route. And whilst that will lead to certain of the occupations, it won't lead to many of them.
Yeah.
And so in many cases, we're working with populations such as returning citizens, those individuals who have, had court involvement and come back. Immigrant populations, that are maybe working in other lower pay occupations currently, but have the capability of pivoting in with the proper support. Obviously, one of the high priorities that we have right now is female workers, because the clean energy sector is very male dominated right now, and the trade sector as well. So those populations are there ready to pivot in if we can reach them and if we can provide them the proper support to do so. And really, that's the only way to meet our goals. And then obviously going back to the idea of clean energy, climate change, the most impacted communities are those communities. They're the ones who have experienced, everything from the heat islands that are causing harm, or the wind and particulate issues are higher in those areas, right? So it's kind of a perfect opportunity to provide them the way to overcome those at the same time as bringing them in and supporting the needs of the Commonwealth. And then I think the second part of the question was, how are we doing it at MASS-CEC, right? So right now we do this through several avenues. As I mentioned, we have a large pool of funds that are dedicated to this, and we administer them through 4 RFP opportunities currently. 2 of them are targeted at training individuals. 1 is targeted at planning. So we often find that there are many groups well equipped to do the training or to support the businesses, but they may not know how to pivot into the clean energy sector. Or they know the clean energy sector, but they don't have all the right components in place to provide the training and support. And then so the 4th one then obviously would be the small business, the disadvantaged business support, helping them pivot in. And the reason we have that particular suite obviously is the individual training needs, but then theory of change is that the clean energy sector is very much dominated by Caucasian male-owned businesses. And the stats, both in our sector and other sectors that are similarly built, is that employers tend to hire, individuals who look like themselves. That's built into hiring bias, whether it's, intentional or not. So the theory of change is that we need to support small businesses that are minority and women-owned so that they will increase the likelihood of hiring the individuals that we are at the same time training. So it's a two-sided coin. And I think it's particularly important in the clean energy sector because the needs assessment found that by and large, I have to look at the stat, but I think it's a good 60% of the businesses are considered small. So we're talking less than 29 employees, where a bigger chunk is actually less than 10.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's small.
It's small. Yeah. So it's not like other sectors where a workforce group can come in and partner with a big corporation, which then could bring on hundreds and hundreds of people. Instead, we're having to go out in the field with our grantees and find, many hundreds of small businesses that have the capability to hire 1 or 2 people at a time. So it's a different sort of scale of problem than some of the other sectors.
Yeah, and tailored.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Wow, interesting. Okay, that was really good. So once you've reached an employer, what should that employer consider in regards to finding the right certifications for that employee or helping to retain that employee?
In terms of certification, I'm going to broaden it just slightly.
Yeah.
So what we find, in not just our sector, but all workforce sectors, is there often is a mismatch between what an employer wants in terms of hireability and what they're looking for in a candidate, and what's the actual reasonable starting point for someone. And one of the big examples of that, the governor put out the idea of the mandate for state jobs that we're not going to look at college degree as the primary indicator, right? That we're going to look at skills.
Yeah.
And so it's the same sort of concept where if someone comes into a trades job, why are you looking for a master's degree? Or why are you looking for even a post-secondary degree?
Yeah.
And so a little bit of that idea of what is the starting point? What capability does an employer have, especially since a lot of these are small companies where a lot of the training does happen on the job. They can be trained up to a certain point prior to that, but really a lot of the skills are gained as they do it. And so kind of level setting with the employer to get them to that point of understanding and acceptance that, you can bring in someone who mostly has the wherewithal and intent to do a good job and has maybe an OSHA certification, maybe has, a hot work certification if they're going into HVAC, but maybe they don't have the other stuff yet. The fact that they have those starting points and that they've, gone through a training program for sometimes 16 weeks, like 4 months or so, shows that there's a will to do a good job and be in the sector, right? So the employer can meet them where they're at and take them from there. And then when you translate that to certification, we often see some of the systemic barriers are focused around licenses and certifications. There's certain licenses and certifications that are only, for example, administered once a year in terms of a test and only administered in English. So if you're dealing in a bilingual population and neighborhood where you want to hire someone from the neighborhood because that might increase your customer base, if they can't pass the test because their English is weaker on paper, that's a barrier right there to hiring, right? And then there's also this sort of uncertainty. Some of the occupations we see that there's not necessarily a clarity on what the industry standard is. For example, the EV tech training right now, the certifications are fairly new. And for most traditional ICE mechanics, it's clearly automotive service excellence, ASE tests. And so it's clarity there of like which tests they take to get to the next step in the job. There's now, to my knowledge, at least 2 or 3 different competing certifications for EV techs. ASE has one. There's another industry group that has one. So the question to the employers is, what do you accept? And then what does the rest of the industry around you accept? Because kind of going back to the idea of looking at the candidate as a candidate as opposed to like a checklist, part of that also is looking at their next step in the career, because that's how you're going to retain them. So if you help them keep growing, it's more likely they're going to stay with you or stay in the industry. And then there's other systemic barriers too. Like, for example, you may send an employee to become a HERS rater, which is clearly defined right now in the state by ResNet. But then there's to get the certification, they have to do 5 audits that are supervised. If your company's already doing HERS rating, generally you can provide that supervised audit pathway. But if your company is just pivoting in and you don't have that, theoretically you can't. And then the question is, where does an employee go to get that supervised audit requirement taken care of? And there's a lack of clarity there right now in the system of how to do that and do it fairly across the board.
Yeah. That's a great example.
Hello, homeowners and renovators. Are you excited about making energy efficient upgrades to your home but concerned about the costs? Well, you're in luck. I'm Molly with your Mass Save Minutes, and today I'm telling you all about how you can finance your home improvements with ease, thanks to Mass Save. Mass Save's financing programs offer several fantastic options to suit your needs without breaking the bank. Let's break down what's available. First up, the 0% interest heat loan program. That's right, 0% interest. This program is perfect for covering the costs of energy-efficient upgrades, like new heating systems, insulation, or windows. With no interest charges, you'll only pay back the amount you borrow, making it easier to manage your budget. If you're eligible for the program, you can receive a loan of up to $25,000 or $50,000 for qualifying projects. This program covers all kinds of energy efficiency upgrades, including, but not limited to, weatherization, electric heating and cooling equipment, electric and heat pump water heaters, windows, electric battery storage, and heat pump projects. Ready to get started? Visit Mass Save's website to explore these options in detail and find the financing solution that works best for you. Their easy-to-use online tools and resources will guide you through the process and help you apply for the financing you need. Don't let financial concerns hold you back from improving your home. With Mass Save's financing options, you can make your home more energy efficient and comfortable without stretching your budget. Head over to the Mass Save website at masssave.com, MASSSAVE.com, to learn more. That's it for today's Mass Save Minute. Thanks for joining us. Remember, don't let your budget stand in the way of energy efficient upgrades. Until next time, stay informed and energy conscious.
Once a community member is trained, what are the barriers that they face in becoming employed in an occupation in the clean energy economy?
So in terms of employability for a participant, there's obviously the hiring bias and mismatch issues where they may come to an employer who has certain expectations and has a checklist. And they may not match that checklist in terms of like degree or other issues. In some cases, for example, we know there are whole occupations where if you have a mark on your CORI, which is, your criminal record, sometimes it's automatic exclusion from even being considered, which in certain cases, you understand the liability and safety concerns. In other cases, it's not as clear as why it would be an automatic exclusion, right? Mm-hmm. So the other thing in terms of like that mismatch is cultural differences, which might sound silly, but a story I have is, so in the past, when I was doing the building automation system training, we would match the graduates with a lot of hotels. So one of the hotels hired one of the most skilled students who came out of the program, and they said to us, "Oh, he's such a good worker, but we can't keep him." And we were like, "Why?" And their response was, "Every time he talks to us, he's yelling at us." And then we sat down with both sides and realized it's culture, like the culture that Jen was from. That's just the way they communicate. So we talk a lot about career readiness and doing mock interviews as part of training programs to help people overcome that. But at the same time, it's also partially letting employers know that, again, that sort of level setting of matching to your populations, meeting them where they're at. Mm-hmm. So it's not a one-way track. It's both sides have to understand the differences and find a good point where it works for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I mentioned the systemic barriers about the licensing, the criminal records. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that might be difficult for a participant is level setting about the quality of the job. Mm-hmm. So sort of a different story. When I was doing the EV tech training, a lot of the individuals got placed at waste companies because they had big needs for mechanics. And a lot of that came down to smell of the trucks. Mm-hmm. And so making a participant understand if you're going to get placed at this sort of company and you're going to be a tech on a big truck, you're going to have to deal with the smell. You're going to have to deal with the mess, and then that's something that is not for everyone. And we're seeing that as a similar case right now, like, for example, the offshore wind industry, where a lot of individuals think it's a great opportunity. They have the right skills to work on the rotors, but they may not have ever climbed that high.
Yeah.
So then the first time they go up, it's like, oof, that's tough, right? So, I mean, we have some interesting groups doing like VR work to like help them understand that.
Yeah, what the experience of the job will be like.
Yeah, and then one of our grantees, one of the unions, is actually refurbishing one of the land-based turbines, and they're going to use it as a climbing training.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so let individuals understand what they're really getting into. But then the other aspect of that, from the long-term perspective, there are certain jobs which aren't great at the start, but there's a career trajectory. So helping individuals understand that, so that they stick out that difficult part, and at the same time, the employer should take on a little bit of that management of level setting, understanding, and like helping the employee know there is a pathway there. It's not just come into this first job and things are not great and then, then what? We have plans coming down the pathway to focus on some of those occupations where the retention is really bad. For example, everyone in the industry knows that weatherization techs, they tend to have a very difficult time retaining weatherization techs. I mean, it's a messy job. A lot of the training happens in the lab where you're doing, blown insulation in a mock wall. But then the job itself is in an attic. And if you've ever climbed into your attic during the summer, you're talking 100 degrees plus, right?
Yeah.
So it's not fun. But it could be a lucrative pathway as long as they continue advancing in their career there. Like, there are options there, and having individuals understand that pathway will help them navigate that initial, bump of difficult, challenging times.
Yeah, stay through their retention.
Yeah.
That's great.
And then the last thing I want to talk about for that is obviously socioeconomic. So we often say in the workforce world, both for clean energy and other sectors, the training is important. It is difficult. But the real difficult part during the retention stage is the socioeconomic issues. So especially in clean energy with trades-driven jobs, you have to worry about transportation. Most of the jobs are not within, the 128 circle. In fact, a lot of them are outside the 495 circle, right? So it's sort of like, if you don't have access to a vehicle, or if you're starting out and due to your economic situation, you can't afford car insurance, there's all these barriers to keeping that job. And then same thing with childcare. Most of the trades jobs start at like 4 a.m., 6 a.m. Daycares aren't open then. And then housing and food instability, like the basic needs. I think a lot of individuals who come up through traditional, college, other paths, they don't necessarily think about sort of the overwhelming nature of that, of not being certain each day and then still having to navigate the job. And then the psychological aspects behind that. I mean, I have one of my favorite stories of a trainee. So during the EV tech training program, there were two brothers that came to us. One of them was like an outright star. Like he knew everything about ICE engines already. So him pivoting into hybrid and EV was easy. In fact, even though he was the youngest guy in the room, all the other people in the room were leaning on him to tutor them. And he was a very good soul. He was out there helping them, on his free time. So one of our best employer partners came in and offered him a position at the second tier union rate. So they bumped him past the entry level rate. They offered him a year lease on a car, a year lease on an apartment because they wanted him that much. He turned it down. And so me and the program manager at the time, we freaked out, of course, but we had built a rapport with him. We pulled him in on the weekend, and that's how much he wanted the job. So it wasn't about will; like he wanted a job.
Yeah.
He came in on the weekend and sat with us, and just hung out and talked. So what we discovered through that was that he and his brother were very housing insecure. They were couch surfing together, and because they were couch surfing together, he didn't want to leave his brother behind.
Yeah.
And so there's that element of like, that was the perfect job for him. That would have started him on a huge trajectory, but he just couldn't do it because of the kind of socioeconomic, psychological aspects of it. So that's a real challenge in the workforce, especially if you're dealing with, vulnerable populations. It's more than just the training. There's a little bit of magic and empathy involved in it.
Yeah, it's the whole person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had a question. You mentioned communities of practice. I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about that.
Sure. So Mass CEC's workforce team does workforce a little bit different than most grant makers. Most workforce grant makers, are very generous and they provide support, but we provide high-touch technical assistance at this stage. So we recognize that starting up new training programs from scratch is very difficult. And so we have a whole concerted system where we provide individual one-on-one TA on a monthly basis where each workforce staff member is matched with a portfolio of grantees. And we have meetings where we actually do some level of like program design assistance. Like we don't actually do the program design as a grant maker, but if we see something going wrong, we provide some opinions and guidance and matchmaking to make things work better. Yeah. At the same time, we have a set suite of monthly communities of practice. And those are designed in a very similar mantra where we're bringing together the grantees to provide TA to each other. So the idea is that they come together, they talk about what they're doing. They talk a lot about like what the barriers they're facing, and then how do they overcome those barriers? What are the best practices they're putting in place and what systems they're putting in place to deal with those barriers.
That's amazing. Sounds really valuable. That's cool.
Wow.
What are the challenges in placement and recruiting after an employee is ready to go into the job market?
So in terms of placement, I think one of the biggest issues right now, again, is that scale. So we're talking about a lot of smaller companies, and they may have one opening at a time. The cadence may not match with the training cadence. So just because a training program runs, until June doesn't mean there's going to be an opening in June. So from a training group's perspective, the advice we often give to our grantees is you're going to have to do a lot more business development than you may be used to. You can't go to that one big company and be assured that you're always going to have an opening at a given time. There's also the seasonality aspect of it and working with both the grantees and the employer partners to figure out how to navigate that. I mean, one of the good examples we have is certain of the jobs obviously will only really happen during the summer or spring, right, when there's not snow on the ground. So what do you do the rest of the time? While that's not, Mass CEC's responsibility to deal with, we obviously need to address it to ensure the quality of the job is good for the participants. And so there is discussion about that. Like if an employer has a lull, how are they dealing with employees? Are they at that point, subcontracted 1099 employees that don't get benefits, which is a different issue, right? Especially if you're dealing with a vulnerable population. But then what are the creative ways that you're helping those participants who graduate and get placed with you deal with that gap in time, if that's the way that things have to operate? One of the great examples I had, one of the hoisting companies I used to work with, they would hoist during the summer when all the construction was happening, and then it would throw a plow on the front of their trucks during the winter. And, he had worked out that schedule. The owner had worked out that schedule where he could guarantee work year round for his participants. And then in terms of recruitment, again, it goes back to those differences in culture, differences in biases, but also just knowing where. the employers and the opportunities are. And being realistic too. Like, for example, going back to the transportation issue, we've seen cases where someone comes into a training program and they really, really want the job. They really do, right? It's like it's game changing for them.
Yeah.
So that sometimes they don't think beyond the initial placement, like, oh, I got an offer from this company that's an hour and a half away. I'm going to do it. I'm going to go there every day. Things come up. And then it's hard to keep the job if it's an hour and a half away, right?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Follow up to that. So say this was a perfect world, right? And those issues you just talked about weren't really issues. Do you think that at the pace that we're training people and getting people into job placements, we're in a place to meet the goals, either the 38,000 jobs or the 2030 or 2050 goals?
So while we're early on in the Equity Workforce Fund in terms of training, I think we're making great progress in terms of the numbers. Another thing that the industry report pointed out was that the solar industry grew a lot faster than we predicted. So I think a lot of stakeholders out there recognize the need for the growth of the labor force. And so things are happening that are going in the right direction.
That's great.
Yeah, in the end, it's a win-win,
Right.
What can listeners do to connect with training opportunities, or if they're employers, to connect their employees with training opportunities?
There's many opportunities out there. We've talked a lot about kind of new entrant trainees, but we do emphasize incumbent worker trainees too. So again, if you're an employer that's working in the clean energy space already or tangential and want to pivot more into it, there are training programs that are providing training for incumbent workers. We have one grantee that will train pre-existing fossil fuel workers with the EV skills so that they can pivot into that. We have other groups that are training HVAC workers with the heat pump skills. In addition to that, we emphasize heavily in our grant making process partnerships. In fact, we generally don't view favorably applications that don't have any employer partners.
Okay.
So if you're an employer and you want to get more directly involved in training, you could find, whether it's a CBO, a mass hire career center, in some cases municipalities apply, and in many cases for-profits are the lead of the grants. So find a partnership, come into the grants, play a role in that. I mean, across the workforce sector, many advocates believe that the best practice is to have the employer help dictate the curriculum and help dictate the eligibility criteria for the training programs, because then those mismatches we talked about earlier are mitigated. You've been directly involved, you can see the quality of the work. There's that element of it. Get involved. This is how you support an investment into human capital that's good for everyone. So
yeah, that's great. What type of grants do you offer?
Sure. So we have 4 different RFPs right now. So we have the Equity Workforce Training Implementation Grants. Those go up to $1.2 million across up to 3 years. Those are focused on specific target populations, individuals from EJ neighborhoods, current and former fossil fuel workers, individuals of federally recognized state and knowledge tribes, and other underrepresented populations in the clean energy sector. So those are designed for 2 possible pathways. One is for individual career training. And to be clear, those training programs could be anywhere from a pre-apprenticeship program to an apprenticeship program, or just a non-apprenticeship model where it's like individual training. And in some cases that could support post-secondary education programs that lead to placement into a trades occupation or engineering, architectural, those sort of occupations that are still supportive of the clean energy sector. We also have within that same RFP a discrete career exploration strand for those groups that want to do a little bit of navigation. We also have what we call the climate critical training implementation grants. And those are funded by state budgets. So unlike the equity training grants, they're open to any Massachusetts resident. And also we use that particular RFP specifically to do incumbent worker training. The reason we set up that way, well, in addition to the fact that there's 2 separate pots of funding backing them, is it allows a group to come in and do a blended and braided application. So oftentimes you'll see that a training program will want to serve equity populations, but the reality is recruiting 100% equity populations in some cases, in some areas, is not possible. We, for example, had a school in the Cape Cod area who came in for application. And when we talked to them, they said basically that, yeah, a good chunk of the population of the student body is from an equity population, but there still is like 30-40% that would not qualify under that. So we were able to blend and braid 2 awards to them so that they could run their training program, recruit from both pools, and still be successful.
Yeah.
So those are the 2 training ones. There's the planning and capacity grants, which are smaller in scale that can go from 20K up to 150K. And those are, again, designed for groups that want to get into training or business support, but they don't have every element in place. They may have to define a curriculum and build it out. They may have to hire additional staff needed. So that's what the planning capacities RFPs do. And then the minority and women business enterprise support RFPs are focused on supporting groups that support networks of MWBEs and DBEs, disadvantaged business enterprises. So it's not designed to directly support one-on-one MWBEs because the scale of that would be difficult. Instead, it's designed to build out a system across the state, and we're gradually moving towards a hub and spoke model, where within a region, like a small business could come over to one of the hubs and realize, I'm going to get a base level of support to pivot into clean energy. And then out of those hubs, they might be referred to a spoke that has specialty in a specific sector. So those are the 4 opportunities under the adult training side. We're in the process of rolling out student and young adult focused RFPs that are coming later this year. So originally they were rolled under those, but we see that the need is out there, and also the need of the population is slightly different. So we have that split going on.
That's awesome. That sounds great.
Yeah, and we'll link to those resources for those of you who are listening.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Employer Summit that you mentioned?
The next Employer Summit would most likely be in the March-April period of 2025. We're eyeing the northern part of the state this time. We had one last March in Western Mass. So we, as you can kind of guess from that, we move around regionally. Going back to the idea that there is some regionality to the needs of the employers and the participants. We had many Western Mass employers, like subcontractors, coming out. MassSave tends to be involved in our convenings, and they come out and talk about their contractor pathways, which are a great opportunity. Groups like Springfield Technical Community College, Greenfield Community College, which are also grantees now, they came out and talk about training opportunities at their locations. And it's just a great way for them to convene businesses out there, and then also introduce them to the existing training and MWBE support grantees, so that it can organically start to grow connections and build more partnerships. And we often do see additional grant applications coming out of that kind of organic growth.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on. We'll link to it, as Michelle mentioned, in the show notes, and make sure people stay up to date with what you have going on. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
I'll just close it out with the kind of message we said earlier of there's this great opportunity here, and there is at the same time a great need to do this in an equitable, inclusive manner, because it's not just the right thing to do, it's the only way we're going to be able to meet the goals.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and it was really interesting to hear more about what you do.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Thank you to our guest, Edward Hsieh, for joining us on today's episode. For more information on what we spoke about today, the show notes and transcript are available at newecology.org/buildingwell-podcast. To learn more about workforce training and other resources from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, visit masscec.com/workforce. That's masscec.com/workforce. You can find Mass CEC on LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube at Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, or on Instagram and X at Mass CEC. You can find New Ecology on Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and X at New Ecology Inc. See you on the next episode.
This episode was made possible by the MassSave Community Education Grant.
The Season 1 Building Well Podcast Committee at New Ecology is led and organized by Alina Michaelevich and Michelle Moran, with Molly Kraft and Michael Abdelmessi.